Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. This is Dr. Crystal Downing, and I am joined by my co-director at the Wade, Dr. David Downing.
Present.
And our marvelous producer. Plus, we have two very special guests, students at Wheaton College who are working at the Wade. One is Chloe DuBois.
Glad to be here.
And the other is Elise Peterson.
Yeah, thank you for having us. This is extremely exciting for me. I've been listening to the podcast since high school. And it's honestly, I would hear these Wheaton professors come on and talk about English and talk about the Wade Center. And I knew I wanted to study English. And I thought, wow, these Wheaton College people specifically, they're amazing. I wish I could study under them. And so this podcast is really part of the reason I'm here in the first place. And it's really entirely the reason I'm working at the Wade Center at all. So,
that's wonderful.
Great. That's great to hear.
And we're so glad to have them working at the Wade Center. That's why we invited them to join us today. And David, why don't you explain the project that you want to highlight in today's podcast?
Okay. We are launching next year a video series called Wonders of the Wade.
We told you about this a year ago, and it took a long time to get to it. So go ahead, David.
We had trouble finding the wonders. It took a long time. Oh, there it is.
No.
I knew we had a wardrobe somewhere. And so these will be launched next year, and they'll be posted on YouTube and on our website the first and third Friday of every month. And then the podcast comes out the fourth Friday of every month. And we're featuring visiting scholars who come to look at unpublished letters by Dorothy Sayers. A lot of Wheaton faculty are coming. You were mentioning coming to the Wade. I was looking at some old Facebook of the Wade Center, and Aubrey Buster was a student worker before she became a professor. So we're going to do a podcast with her next year. She's doing a series on the Hansen lectures. But it's interesting to see someone go from student to student worker to staff or faculty member at Wheaton. So we'll be covering a lot of the furniture. Crystal and I talk about the wardrobe, C.S. Lewis's desk, Tolkien's desk. We talk about things in the reading room, first editions of The Hobbit and the Narnia Chronicles, and we'll be talking about unpublished letters and manuscripts. So we invited Chloe and Elise to come here to talk about a little bit. First, let's talk about your work at the Wade Center, and then we're going to go around and different people are going to talk about your treasure or your wonder of the Wade. We're here with Aaron, our producer, who did one of the episodes, and Crystal did one, and I did one. And eventually, if we continue this series into 2025, we might have Elise and Chloe to do some. So tell us a little about working at the Wade Center.
Yeah, so I started working at the Wade Center in January 2022. I'd always wanted to work there, but Elise actually was really instrumental in helping me actually get the job. So I'm really thankful for that. And it's just been one of my absolute favorite experiences at Wheaton, and probably in my life too. It's just been really special to be able to work with these primary sources and work with these scholars who are so good at what they do and just support the study of Lewis, Tolkien, and the other Wade authors among students and among staff, and try to incorporate their works into my own projects and papers. So I've specifically worked with a lot of really interesting things at the Wade. One of the highlights was last year I got to work on the C.S. Lewis library. So we own over 2,500 of C.S. Lewis's original books that he wrote in or annotated or read. And so my job was to go through each of those books, look at the annotations, look at the marginalia, find signatures, which was amazing to actually touch these books that he'd interacted with and see how they influenced his own writing and his own life. And so Jill Walker, the catalog librarian, and we put together a feature on the Wade Center catalog. So you can now search on the catalog according to which of Lewis's books have annotations, which books have marginalia. It's very helpful for scholars and also for anyone who just wants to take a look at what Lewis had in his personal library. So that's been a highlight for sure.
And that's so important what you did.
Yeah, that is. Lewis's library, there's 2,500 books, many of which he wrote in. That's one of the most favorite things that people come to the Wade Center for. You can't get that anywhere else.
And you would assume that at a place like the Wade Center, we would have had all that documented a long time ago. But one of the things you discover when you come to the Wade Center is there's just so much stuff,
right,
and so much depth that you will pick up something. You know, this is part of the wonders of the Wade. You'll pick up something you'll open up a Lewis book, and there had been notations of all the marginalia, but you'll flip to a page that nobody had flipped to
Right
before.
through. It's
Yeah.
true.
And then you go, oh, wait,
Yeah.
he underlined this passage and nobody had ever noticed that before. And so
Yeah.
those kinds of projects are needed because there's just so much there that quantifying it. I mean, the stuff
Right.
that's in the the stuff that hasn't been quantified, there's just so much there. It's really
Yes.
And
fascinating.
sometimes the scholars point them out to us. I was in the
Yeah.
reading room and a scholar called me over and said, Dr. Downing, or David, look at this. And she's a doctor. She said, hey, Dr. Downing. Anyway, she said, hey, look at this. And it was a book by Samuel Butler in which he says, this is a matter of rational demonstration, not mystical intuition. And Lewis was very impressed with Christian mysticism. So he writes in the margin, this man is a fool. And he says, mysticism is an experience, a direct experience of the presence of God in your life. And I had never seen that or heard of it, never seen it quoted. It was just a scholar who called me over.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's an important project.
And you had
Glad
written a
you're
book
doing
on Lewis and mysticism.
it. I did, and I hadn't seen this quotation.
Wow.
I should have come to the Wade more often before I wrote that book.
That's cool. Yeah.
How about you, Elise?
Yes, so I'm an archival clerk. I work under the great Laura Stanifer.
Mhm.
And so my work is mostly processing new articles and book reviews about the Wade authors and putting them in our article file, which is just a huge collection of reviews, articles, essays by and about the authors. I have also been working through a lot of like backlogged projects, things that we acquired years ago and just haven't gotten around to processing. So last year I went through with my coworker Bryce several big white banker's boxes full of newspaper clippings from anywhere from the 40s to the 80s of just book reviews and movie reviews, processing those. There were a few gems in there. I found one from 1979 that it was a review of Lord of the Rings, and the author pretty much said, these teenagers are going crazy. This
Oh.
book, in 25 years, we're going to look back and we're going to say, what were we thinking?
Little
that's
did they
funny.
know.
Oh, yeah.
That's funny.
That was very satisfying to read in
Yes.
2022. And then currently I'm processing some new Lewis letters that we acquired, and I'm writing transcripts for them, which is quite the task
Oh.
because
Oh, Lewis handwriting.
very bad handwriting.
Yes.
Oh,
Same
you all
with
are talking
Sayers.
about highlights of working at the Wade. We had a student worker who was transcribing Charles Williams' letter to a young woman, and they just got a little strange, and there's some emotional boundaries there that weren't being respected. And she asked to be excused from the assignment. Could she work on something else? Yeah, so you kind of get to see some of our authors in primary documents in a way that you
Yeah.
might not in
Right.
published
What
documents.
can I ask? What era is that from Lewis's life? Is it later in life or?
I
You
believe
know?
it's from about 58 till the early 60s. So it's right at the end of his life.
Okay.
Where
Yeah.
his handwriting gets very, very bad.
Yeah.
We
Right.
still get new ones. Just a couple of months ago,
Yeah.
we were talking about the Narnia Chronicles, and this older woman said, I wrote him a letter, and he wrote me back. We said, what?
She was
So
just
all
a
of a sudden-
visitor in the.
Wow.
Yeah, we hit
Museum.
security. We locked all the doors. This alarm goes, wow, 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 and said, you have a letter from C.S. Lewis? And she said she was reading The Last Battle, and there was a paragraph that didn't make sense. And she wrote to Lewis and said, I was reading this, and it didn't. And he wrote back and said, you know what? They left out a couple of sentences.
Mhm.
And so he filled in the missing sentences. And that would make you so proud. Unfortunately, she was a little girl. She was like 9.
Yeah.
And she said, I love all 8 of the Narnia Chronicles. And so we wrote back and said, I'm so glad you saw this. It's actually a misprint. I'll check with the publisher. P.S. There are only 7 Narnia Chronicles. So,
Why did he have to
Yeah.
include that? Come on, Lewis.
so she feels kind of bad that her mistake is permanently enshrined
Yeah.
in Lewis's
Oh no, that's kind
handwriting.
of cute, actually.
When you're
Yeah.
9 years old, it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. But that's part of the reason it's fun to work at the Wade. These things, you never know when something new
Yes.
is going to show up.
And
that
we
can talk
asked
about.
her if we could have a copy of the letter Lewis sent her. And so she allowed us to have a copy of it. So every year, new stuff comes in that is just found in odd ways.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, thanks for your service. Everyone's very impressed with your work at the Wade. And Elise, you were going to add something?
I was just saying thank you.
Oh,
Okay. When you said Laura Stanifer, our wonderful archivist, who's really an institution, she's been at the Wade for over 20 years. And we have about 100 books which say acknowledgments to Marge Mead and Laura Stanifer.
Yeah.
But when you said Laura, Chloe started doing this thing where you show your appreciation.
Yes.
Snaps to Laura.
We've never done that before on the podcast.
Yes.
So I want you to say we really acknowledge the wonderful work of Laura Stanifer. And then we're all going to do props with.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
This is a first for the podcast.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So how do you feel about Laura Stanifer?
Laura is the best boss in the world.
Oh, there you go.
snaps.
All right. Props. Crystal, I can't hear you.
I can't snap.
Oh no!
I never have been able to snap.
Oh, that's
no.
sad.
You did that on
That's why
purpose.
he did. Yes.
I didn't know that. I don't know if that's come up before. Okay, well, let's go ahead and talk about this project again, Wonders of the Wade. And we're trying to get some lesser known, everyone knows about the wardrobe and things. I think I'm going to go counterclockwise. Crystal did an episode. She's writing a book right now called The Wages of Cinema.
Yes.
And it's about looking at cinema through a Christian aesthetic. And she draws heavily on Dorothy Sayers' views on not only art and beauty and being a human creative, but also her specific thoughts about film.
Right.
So, Crystal, tell us about what you discovered in researching Dorothy Sayers at the Wade.
Well, I discovered that the 4-volume collected letters of Dorothy Sayers left out every single letter where Sayers praises a movie she saw. It includes some letters where she excoriates how crummy a movie is, like The Silent Peter Pan and some other things. So because I have already written a book on film called Salvation from Cinema that is used in secular universities in religion and film programs, I wanted to write something that was specifically focused on a Christian aesthetic, which ties to the Trinity in the paradigm that Dorothy Sayers set up.
If our parents had written a book on film, it would have been called Loss of Salvation Through Cinema.
I know,
What do you think that would have been their...
Right. Well, we grew up as fundamentalists where you did not go to movies. So I read through most of Sayers' letters, especially after she went to Oxford University. And what people don't realize is that Oxford had 9 movie theaters by 1914. So film spread rapidly to England. And my discovery then was these movies she praised. And what's interesting, like one of the movies she loved and she told her parents about was Cabiria, which most film scholars say is one of the most significant films in the history of film, the first dolly shot ever done. So she has...
Sounds like a country in risk. I just conquered Cabiria. What is that?
Well, it's complicated to explain.
Okay.
And there's one clip, the dolly shot is... It dollies in to show a big statue of the idol Moloch that young children are being fed to Moloch. So it part of it is set in Babylon.
No wonder our parents don't like movies.
So that is my wonder of the Wade, that nobody knew how much Dorothy Sayers loved cinema. So it legitimized using her Christian aesthetic. And basically, I'm arguing that it was her experience of film that helped lead her to develop a Christian aesthetic that Christians need to use, because all too many Christians, when they watch movies, they turn movies into a content delivery system where they just extract messages and don't value the artistry of the film itself. So that is the thesis of my book, based on unpublished Wonders at the Wade.
Wow.
And that will be one of the episodes that we're going to show next year. Aaron also did an episode for us. Tell us briefly about.
Well, I couldn't find my notes, so it's definitely going to be brief.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So I was working. I was working on the academic journal that the Wade Center publishes at the time, and I was editing an article that was on what we called a lost letter from Letters to Malcolm. And so this letter is about Lewis on scripture interpretation. There's actually probably some kind of controversial stuff in there regarding scripture interpretation, stuff that might make evangelicals squirm a little bit. And so we were publishing this, but I had to go back and verify the transcription of the chapter. And so in order to do that, we actually have a copy of the manuscript of Letters to Malcolm that was sent to the publisher. So I'm looking through this, big manuscript, and, while you're in there, why not poke around a little bit? Mm-hmm. And so I started poking around a little bit, and I started working on something for another project and came back to it and basically just discovered that there were giant sections of it that had been deleted, more than just this one letter. And particularly the last chapter of Letters to Malcolm was deleted, and then they sent the revisions into the publisher at the last minute. And so the whole last chapter of Letters to Malcolm was rewritten. There was a whole different narrative. He was interpreting a parable from the book of Luke that he tried to include in there, and all of that was scrapped. And even the last line of the book was itself changed. So, a lot of people place significance on it, where he says till Saturday, at the end of the book.
Yeah.
Right.
But at the end of the book, he actually originally had that joke about taking the railroad and they've flung a planer into the works or something like that. And so he actually ends the book on a pun originally, but he crosses that out when he sends in the updates.
Oh.
So it was really fascinating to discover just the extent of the revisions of this book, and that there was this whole section that had been pulled out. And then what's interesting is that section was also living in a separate document someplace else that was kind of standalone on its own, and it wasn't clear where it came from. There was no notes. It was just sort of like, here's a fragment that we had discovered in Warney's papers, and it turns out that Warney had transcribed the section that was deleted at some point. And so discovering all of this and seeing how it's all connected and realizing that nobody's ever read it before unless they've actually come to the Wade Center because it's still unpublished.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah, that's great.
Speaking of Letters to Malcolm, there's a first draft before he came up with the idea of letters where he tried to talk about prayer, but he got stuck. I think it's because it sounds too almost presumptuous to go, I'm going to tell you what prayer is like and what effective. And I think he didn't like the voice. So the idea of talking to a friend about prayer. Here's the big revelation, folks. There is no Malcolm. People always ask Lewis. In one of the drafts, he calls it Letters to Charles. And I have a feeling he's kind of thinking imaginatively, if Charles Williams had lived longer, what if we corresponded about prayer?
Interesting.
But one of the early drafts, before he got into the epistolary structure, he says he saw a little girl who saw this cute dog across the road, and she just ran across the road, and she threw her arms around the dog, and she said, "Oh, you beauty." And Lewis said, I think that's a lot of the way we should respond to God. We're not flattering God. We're not asking God for anything. We're just acknowledging how wonderful he is.
Yeah.
And only Lewis would see a little girl throwing her arms around the neck of a dog as, an emblem of our attitude toward God. So I think that's another piece that I wish someone would do more work on.
It's very fascinating because he actually talks about that parable. It's the parable of the unjust steward that he talks about.
Oh, right.
And he actually talks about it in a number of his letters, and his interpretation evolves over time. And I believe that it was influenced by Joy Davidman and Dorothy Sayers, as he credits later in the letters. Sorry.
Dorothy Sayers?
I was blanking there for a second.
Wow. Yeah. We're so glad today to have Aaron Hill.
Yes. Sorry.
Okay, no thanks. That was very interesting. And later on, if you follow the Wonders of the Wade video series, you'll see Aaron talking about that in more detail.
Yeah.
And we wanted to talk to Chloe and Elise about Wonders of the Wade, some individual things that you consider to be definitely worth considering if you visit the Wade Center. So, Chloe, tell us a little bit about your wonder.
Yes. So before I get to my actual wonder, I just have to give a shout out to C.S. Lewis's academic robe because
Okay.
Because
explain that.
Well, I brushed lint off of it last
Oh,
fall.
wow. Oh, wow. Oh, did you save the lint?
Laura and I were thinking about it.
Yeah, right.
Oh.
It's like a saint's relic.
Yeah, but that was just very amusing to actually get to do that. And that's been a story that I've shared with a lot of people. And they always look at me like, they have C.S. Lewis's academic robe at the Wade and you brushed lint off of it? And I say, yes, I did. You should come and see it for yourself.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
But my actual wonder, I guess, is Lewis's letter discoveries that I made inside of his actual manuscripts and books that I cataloged. So I have 4 to share here. And if anybody would like to do a project on these, please come to the Wade and look through them yourself. But I found these very amusing. So the first one comes from The Poetical Works of Armstrong, Dyer, and Green by George Gilfin. And so Gilfin writes on page 106, he discusses Dyer's children who, quote, leaping over him as he lay on the sofa, and now dancing around him in their uncontrollable glee. It may be laid down as an axiom that all true poets love little children and are loved by them in return. And C.S. Lewis in the margins wrote, Milton must have loved being pinned to his chair and jumped over on his sofa.
He was famous. He went blind in later years, and he taught Milton, not Lewis. Milton went blind in later years, and he taught his daughters to read phonetically Greek and Hebrew so they could read to him aloud because he couldn't read it.
Wow.
But he didn't teach them Greek and Hebrew. He just taught them to read phonetically. So this would be a different relationship to your children than the one you just described.
Yes.
I doubt if there was much jumping on the couch or jumping on the bed. Yeah.
And then our second one comes from the works of the Right Honorable Edmund Burke, Volume 2, by Edmund Burke. And so this one was funny because as I opened the title page, Lewis had written on the title page, page 537, bears are not philosophers. And I thought to myself, what is that referring to? So I flipped to page 537 and Burke had written, a bear loves, licks, and forms her young, but bears are not philosophers. So I assume that Lewis found that amusing. And then the third one is from The Recovery of Man in Childhood, a study in the educational work of Rudolf Steiner by A.C. Harwood. And Harwood writes, all little children love counting. Who has not lain in bed as a child and set himself the quite impossible task of counting up to 1,000? And Lewis wrote, me.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, right.
It still amazes me that his brilliant mother, who got a degree in mathematics in the 19th century when very few women were getting degrees in anything, produced a child who just repudiated mathematics. And I legitimize my own repudiation of mathematics by saying I guess I'm too much like C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
Repudiation is a kind interpretation.
Yeah.
He just wasn't good at numbers.
It's crazy though, but if you read some of his logic stuff, in his philosophy where he's writing out like symbolic logic and he's not, it's not that he doesn't have a brain for it. He just didn't like numbers, I guess.
Yeah, that's what's odd. He actually, the math exam to get into Oxford, he flunked. And then he went off to World War I, and when he came back, they had a policy that veterans didn't have to take the math exam.
Really?
So
that's the only reason he got in then.
Yeah,
Wow.
Christian's theory is that God allowed for World War I so that C.S. Lewis could get his degree. Oh, sorry. Yeah, in any case,
I just hear that all the time, that he was bad at math, and he was. But then you look at some of his really logic stuff, and I'm like, I'm having a hard time following this.
I know.
Right.
I
And
know.
you're like, he clearly has a brain for that sort of logic working out things. He didn't load. He loaded,
Yeah.
I guess.
But see, he loved ideas rather than numbers.
The abstraction
So-
probably just really,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's the way I just tell my staff at the Wade, I don't do numbers.
The other day, Chris and I and Marge were talking about an author who was born in 1937, and they said, how old would they be now? And I goes, I think she would be 74. No, and let's see, it's 19. And the three of us couldn't come up with it. We finally went to Wikipedia and said, oh, okay, we get it. She's 86. Okay, great.
Go on,
back to you, Chloe.
Chloe.
Sorry.
Okay. My final wonder is from Essays and Studies by Members of the English Association, Volume 20. And this one in particular was a huge find for me. I don't know if anyone else has found this. I'd assume someone has, but Jill and Laura said they'd never seen it before, so that was exciting. So this book actually contains one of Lewis's original drafts. And since Lewis burned most of his drafts, we don't actually get a chance to look at his drafting process. So this one in particular, the essay included an article by E.M. Tilliard in which Tilliard critiqued an earlier essay by Lewis. And so Lewis was responding to Tilliard's essay in which Tilliard had responded to him. And so he's literally annotating this book with responses to Tilliard. And then I flipped to the next volume of this series, and the next volume contained the published version of Lewis's draft. And I think that this book later became The Personal Heresy, just based on the subject material. And I found that very cool. So if any scholar is looking for a thesis, you should come to the Wade and look at that.
Oh,
that's pretty cool.
Great.
The Personal Heresies, their exchange of essays back and forth. The main thing that strikes me is what an incisive mind Lewis had, and what, I wouldn't say cluttered mind Tilliard had, but he just sort of, it's like an old preacher who tells a story and then quotes something and then goes back to something. And, it's just an interesting exchange. But you can see the young Lewis, you can see that really trenchant logician coming through in that exchange of letters.
It's also fascinating to see how so much of what Lewis wrote was in response to what somebody else had written.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
we think of him as this original thinker, and he certainly was. He had plenty of great thoughts, but he, much like G.K. Chesterton, had this ability to see exactly where someone's argument had gone wrong or all the mistakes that they were making.
Right.
And then not only, sort of from an apologetic standpoint, break down, where they had gone wrong, but provide like a persuasive, a beautiful case for the opposite. And so it's always fascinating to discover these sort of sources where he's arguing with them in the margins, or, it's clear that this is the thing that set him off, and this is why he's written this document, this book.
That could be a dissertation or a book, because Lewis is a counterpuncher. He reads The Control of Language, the Green Book, which says all values are subjective. And next thing you know, we have Abolition of Man, which is refuting the Green Book. And we have the Green Book. It really is a Green Book.
Yeah.
Its work on Milton is largely refuting T.S. Eliot's view of Milton. So you're exactly right. He was almost like the sand got into the oyster, and eventually the pearl of Lewis's response grew around that irritation.
Yes.
Well, in fact, Chloe, while you were chatting, and one of the books that Lewis was responding to was by Edmund Burke.
Yes.
It made me think I need to do some research, because Edmund Burke had a certain view of the sublime that probably influenced Lewis in Abolition of Man.
Oh, definitely.
Versus the Wordsworthian view. Wordsworth and Coleridge were very influenced by Kant's, Immanuel Kant's view of the sublime. And that's a weakness within Abolition of Man. So anyway, you have ignited my interest.
Yay.
So thank you.
This podcast is becoming a series of topics that scholars should come to the Wade and research.
Yeah, that's exactly.
I would say it's been that for a long time. David's been handing those out for free for years now.
There's 50 more in this podcast to choose from.
Okay. And so, Elise, thanks, Chloe. That was a great list.
Yeah,
that was definitely an inducement to come and look at some primary documents. Elise, what would you consider to be a wonder of the Wade for you?
Yes, so I actually saw the original manuscript in an exhibition at Marquette. I saw this with the Tolkien Society. So we do not own the original document, unfortunately. I don't know if we see Marquette as competition or not. But
No, very complimentary.
Okay, good.
Laura takes students up every year to see Bill Fliss, and Tolkien gave a lot of his primary documents to Marquette, which is only about 90 minutes away from us up in Milwaukee.
Yeah, so
we're on very friendly terms.
Okay.
So
yes, that was an amazing trip, and there was a whole exhibition called J.R.R. Tolkien: The Art of the Manuscript. So there were maps and letters and manuscripts and charts that he'd made and all these things. So we don't have the original document, but we do have the exhibition catalog. The exhibit is no longer available at Marquette. So the only place you can see this is in this book. So it is at the Wade Center.
Oh, good.
It is no longer available to be seen at Marquette. So
when we went to Marquette, excuse me for interrupting, but Chris and I went, and Bill had made a chart he's the archivist at Marquette. He and Laura are good buddies. And he wanted to do all the drafts of Lord of the Rings, starting with when M had a birthday party, and later it's not M, it's Bilbo. And his chart had gotten so long, it was like a piece of shelf paper. It wasn't like 12 feet long, all the different drafts.
Yeah,
It was
very
fascinating.
long.
It would really take a lifetime to chart all the different drafts and sub-drafts. But he had them all charted on this long piece of shelf paper. It was really fascinating.
Mm.
There was a digital version of something like that at the exhibition where you could say, I want to see this significant moment in Lord of the Rings, like Éowyn declaring, I am no man. And you
Right.
could see the way he edited it through all these different drafts.
Mm.
But anyway, what the paper I want to talk about specifically was his manuscript near the end of Return of the King, after Frodo and Sam have destroyed the ring. They wake up in Gondor, and then they are brought out to the field of Carmallen, and they are being praised. Everyone is shouting, praise them with great praise for destroying the ring. It's just a very emotional and big
Right.
celebration. Aragorn kneels before them. It's a huge deal. And I was seeing the page of this manuscript, and at the very bottom, right where it's saying, praise them with great praise, the ink had been splotched.
Hmm.
And a little plaque next to that said, in a letter to his aunt, Tolkien revealed that he cried while he wrote this.
Oh.
And the document
Oh.
is now smudged with his tears.
Oh.
And
Wow.
that was just, to me, that was just such a good demonstration of specifically why we should keep the originals. Laura posed
Wow.
the question to me one time, why is it important that we keep, like, why can't we just make transcriptions and throw everything away? Or why can't we just make photocopies and throw everything away?
Hmm.
And that to me is just one of the clearest examples and one of the coolest things I've ever seen
Mm.
from one of the Wade
Yes.
authors of just,
Yeah.
how personally important this was to
Right,
Tolkien. And
right.
Right. You know what else that is? That's Tolkien's DNA.
exactly.
So
Wow.
it's not
We need
just
to clone
pointed.
him.
Exactly.
Tolkien's DNA.
Exactly. When I told my dad about you rolling lint off of C.S. Lewis's academic robes, and
Yes.
he said, "Do you think you could make a C.S. Lewis clone?"
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly what Laura said.
Yeah.
Oh,
There's-
right.
Yeah.
There's definitely some-
Jurassic inklings. You know?
There's definitely some artifacts at the Wade that you probably could lift some DNA from. For
Yeah,
some of those.
that's
yeah,
right.
Yeah, we've got Warren
Well-
Lewis's army coat, and
Is
we've
that
got
a pen that
Tolkien's pen.
Tolkien chewed on?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
You know, Lewis, I'm switching back to what you said, Elise. When Tolkien read it aloud to the Inklings, when the Riders of Rohan finally show up, they just feel this almost sense of despair, and suddenly they go, horns, horns, the Riders of Rohan had arrived. Lewis wept when he's in the Inklings meeting when he heard
Wow.
that. We didn't capture the tears, but he was very emotionally involved in the Lord of the Rings story.
Oh, this just emphasizes the importance of the Wade because, this whole podcast emphasizes that. But in terms of drawing non-Christians as well, and I refer to a speaking engagement that David and I had not that long ago to a non-Christian organization that was putting on a conference on film,
Mm.
and they heard of the Wade, and that they thought, oh, well, we want someone to talk about the Narnia films and the Tolkien films. And so during this conference, when I started discussing first film adaptation, because I've written a lot about film, but then I made a transition into C.S. Lewis, someone started heckling us from the crowd, yelling, C.S. Lewis was a narrow-minded Christian. And then, and luckily the Holy Spirit was with me, and I just was calm about it, and then yelled, C.S. Lewis hated women, and all this. So I handed things over then, as we planned, to David, but he started talking about Tolkien and started showing film clips from the Tolkien films. And the woman started crying when she saw the clips from the Lord of the Rings movies. And she came over to me and apologized for interrupting, and then said, can I come talk to you at the Wade sometime? Yeah.
And we said, of course you can. Now, we have moved the Wade to Alaska, but feel free to come. We'd love to interact with you.
But especially Tolkien fascinates non-Christians. I was speaking to some Muslims who came in because of Tolkien
Oh, wow.
to the Wade. So this is a real ministry opportunity for us at the Wade.
Yes, I saw a post online one time about the very end scene of Lord of the Rings when they're going into the West. And these people were saying, I don't know what it is about this scene, but it makes me feel so profoundly sad and happy at the same time.
Oh.
And I wanted to be like, oh, It's sort of what you've talked about on the podcast. I'm going to pronounce this wrong. Sensucht?
Oh, Sehnsucht. Yeah.
Sensucht. Yes. That was fascinating to me that these people who had no idea Tolkien was a Christian could feel this deep spirituality.
Yes, right.
Yeah. And I even met one of my trip leaders this summer. I went on an Inklings tour of England and Ireland.
Oh,
and one of my trip leaders gave his testimony about how reading Tolkien and Lord of the Rings actually brought him to Christ.
Oh,
which was really beautiful.
Wonderful. Mm.
I read it in junior high. I didn't even know Tolkien was a Christian, and I didn't know he was a friend of Lewis. So I had a lot of learning to do when I first read Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I read it in college, and I had no idea there was any connection between the two of them. And I was a huge C.S. Lewis fan.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. In fact, David was going through a period of doubt in college, and it was reading Lewis that brought him back. So this is important, what the Wade is doing. It's preserving artifacts, but it's so much more than that. How do these artifacts, how do these authors draw people in and then provide opportunities for conversation?
So Wheaton's motto is for Christ and his kingdom. Should the Wade's motto be for Christ and the Inklings? Would that be
David?
Oh no, that doesn't. Sorry. That doesn't work. Sorry, that leaves out Dorothy Sayers and. George
But it's a
MacDonald.
reason that those of you who listen to the podcast and appreciate it might think of supporting the Wade in your appreciation, because we're entirely self-funded.
That was that's what's called product placement. What do
Yes.
you call that? little infomercial. Well, let's move on to. Do I get to share mine, or should we move on to?
You
the
can
new
share
wonders?
yours.
My episode, Chris and I do several together about items in the museum. We recently acquired a book called Heimskringla, which means the Circle of the Earth. It's by Snorri Sturluson, the same one
Say that 3
Icelandic
times fast,
scholar.
David.
Yeah, I know, Snorri Sturluson. And he used to sell seashells at the seashore. So it's amazing. Snorri sells. Anyway, Heimskringla is a chronicle of mythical kings like Odin and then real kings of Iceland and Norway. And Lewis and Tolkien both owned copies of it. They both could read Icelandic, Old Norse, but they also had English translations.
Of course they could.
Exactly. And the one that we have is Lewis's own with his underlinings and comments. But as I was reading it, every time they talk about the evils of magic, Lewis underlines it. He always had this suspicion of magic. You see it in Magician's Nephew, and you see it in his scholarly books. But also the Viking, they have these big dragon-headed ships, these Viking prows, and they look like the Dawn Treader. And he actually underlined one line that said the ship was called the Long Serpent, and there's a picture of it. Lewis underlined that. So it's interesting to see how Lewis is assimilating this material. But also, as you're reading, there's a character named Durin the Dwarf. There's a place called Westfold. There is a bad character named Tory Treebeard. And when he dies, he's sent to the trolls.
Wow.
So I wonder if this book, I think you could talk about how it both influenced Lewis and Tolkien. I wrote a blog about that, our off-the-shelf blog at the Wade website. Talk about this is an important imaginative source for Lewis and Tolkien. So that was my episode. Now, Elise and Chloe have created a new Wonder of the Wade. And it's only available in the primary documents. This is actually becoming a trilogy, right? Because we have the original Murder at the Wade. Let's talk about the Murder at the Wade, because I think we're also going to take your latest project, which is a riff on the Christmas Carol, but it's set at the Wade. We have a Scrooge-like scholar who needs to undergo some spiritual reformation. But let's talk about Murder at the Wade. Tell us about your work that you created.
Oh, yes. So it's very silly. I also got the idea for this from the podcast because you mentioned the fire suppression system in the basement.
We did joke about that.
Yes.
Right, yeah.
It removes oxygen from the air and puts carbon dioxide or something else in. And so you said, oh, that would make a good murder mystery. And I thought, oh, it would. I know that when we had originally talked about doing Wonders of the Wade, you said, oh, maybe you could talk about this for your thing. And I thought, that would be so prideful to say the best thing at the Wade Center.
That'd be great. Forget Lewis. Forget talking.
Oh, yes. But I can read it now. And then Chloe wrote Penance at the Wade, which I'll let her talk about that in a minute. But yes, so this is a fictionalization of just sort of a horrible researcher. I also want to stress Dr. Stein, the main character, is not real. He is not.
Okay, we have no one in mind.
I do not know a Dr. Stein.
Okay. Jerry Root, we're not talking about you.
But yes, so I guess I'll just begin. I can read. All right, Murder at the Wade. We made this Halloween of last year.
And it's illustrated. We're sorry you can't
It
see
is,
this
yes.
on
Oh,
the podcast.
Chloe
Chloe
is
made
an
lovely
amazing
illustrations.
artist.
Charming illustrations.
She illustrated all three, and so unfortunately we can't share those, but you do get to share your poem.
Yeah.
So, all right. For all the wise researchers who have studied at the Wade, professor types and intellect, some the kindest ever made, there is one man whose name alone sends shivers down the spines of archivists and books alike, the dreaded Dr. Stein. Stein arrives at 10 to noon, demanding fragile books. He carries in a coffee cup, ignoring Laura's looks. He also grasps a ballpoint pen and keeps more in his pack. Stein fetches articles himself. Worse yet, he puts them back. His fingers smudge old photographs, protective gloves he shuns. He snacks on muffins while he works, ignoring everyone. Outside the reading room, I'm told his conduct's even worse. He sits in Jack's old desk chair and misquotes Tolkienian verse. He hasn't heard of Sayers and thinks Chesterton's a loser. He claims Tolkien wrote allegories and Perelandra was a snoozer. He annotates, pulls wardrobe drawers, and doesn't wash his hands. Believe me, anxious reader, it was more than we could stand. You may not be surprised, therefore, to learn what we discovered. One fine fall morning at the Wade, a body was uncovered. It was, as you have doubtless guessed, the evil Dr. Stein who lay upon the floor of fragile storage, his face a bluish gray. While Stein was scanning shelves, it seems, some Wade employees saw their chance. They started up the fire alarm, which released a noxious gas. Whoever killed him, none could say. He defended the whole crew. Archivists, librarians, student workers, Downings too. We hired no detectives, for Stein's fate had been dictated. The garden just outside the Wade was being renovated. We buried deep the body of the one who'd caused much woe. Still upon his unmarked grave, naught but thistles grow. There are strict rules and guidelines that must always be obeyed. Heed them, wise researcher, lest you be murdered at the Wade.
Oh, that is so good.
Crystal, let's hear some snapping.
Oh.
I can't hear you.
Well, and
So clever.
the poem is predicated on the fact that what we allow anybody who makes arrangements in advance to see for free is any of our fragile first editions, unpublished letters. But because of that, there are these rules that you can't bring ballpoint pens in, and definitely not food or drink, or even backpacks, because there have been the problem before that law was invented that some people took items from the reading room. So Elise and Chloe just took this wonderful idea of the rules at the Wade and what happens if somebody does not obey them.
And then Dr. Stein repented, or we think. We actually don't know. His motivations are very unclear. But last spring, I wrote this follow-up poem. I was just sitting in the library before my class, and this came to me in about 20 minutes. So I don't know, poetry hits me like that. But so this is Penance at the Wade, and this is Dr. Stein's apology for all of the things he has done. So, hello again, it's Dr. Stein, alive and well, for a time, to beg your pardon and reprieve, if you will but my sins relieve. Excuse the coffee stains and drips, excuse the smudges and the rips. Excuse the photos I've defiled. Excuse the articles unfiled. Excuse the markings in that book. Here are the manuscripts I took. And please excuse my heinous sin that moonless night when I broke in to steal, read the Lewis books in stacks. I thought I'd covered up my tracks when one of you, I won't say who, discovered me and misconstrued the reason for my nighttime haunt and left my body, slain and gaunt, upon the floor and said no more before they left and locked the door. What happened to your longtime friend? Did I, as Dante claims, descend to undiscovered spheres of hell that sinful scholars know too well? Or did I board a bus instead? You'll never know because I'm dead. For now, just let me plead my case. If you will but my sins erase and give this poor repentant shade a chance to research at the Wade, I'll be a perfect saint. It's true. No murders at the Wade for you.
Oh, that is great.
So some of these need to be footnoted. Boarding the bus is a great divorce.
Yes.
Yeah.
Earlier, you were talking about a new garden where he gets buried, and we actually have a beautiful new garden at the Wade, less than a year old, called Aslan's Garden, in honor of Marjorie Mead. So we're going to have to footnote these for historians later on.
Well,
to
and in
catch all the
fact,
allusions.
we're having a series of lectures about Dante
yay.
and the Inferno starting in January, the Hansen Lectures, where a professor at Wheaton will be talking about how when he teaches Dante, he acknowledges the amazing interest that Wade authors had in Dante.
We have an artifact that you might call blunders of the Wade. Someone donated a comic book in which Mickey Mouse and Goofy go to the Inferno.
Oh,
It's
What?
very strange. Have you all seen that?
no.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, well, ask them for it. It's very amusing. At the end, the judges take the guys who wrote the comic book and they consign them to the Inferno. It's really hilarious. So I wouldn't make a trip all the way just for that. But if you're at the Wade, go ahead and have a look at that. Now, right now it's a trilogy.
Mhm.
So now the third one, we're not going to have you read because it's so charming. It's a riff on Christmas Carol, and it's so wonderfully illustrated that we're going to present it as a blog entry, if that's okay with you all.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
And
It's an honor.
since this is Christmas season, we'll post it on our Wade blog sometime in the next week or 10 days because it's very timely right now.
Yes.
And it's just as clever as these two poems that you read. And a little longer. Is your work's getting longer?
Well, this one took us about 20 minutes to read.
Yes, it's 30 pages long. We started writing it in September. So
Okay, so we'll let people view that on our off the shelf blog. Is this going to be like Narnia, where there'll be 7 eventually? The Adventures of Dr. Stein?
Or
Uh,
8.
Is it
Yeah.
pretty soon, or is it going to be a full-length novel? It's
Yeah, that's right.
exciting.
Well, thanks for joining us, Chloe and Elise. And we love the conversation about not only your work at the Wade, but your play at the Wade. So thank you for joining us. This would be a good podcast to put out in December.
Yeah.
And then next year, we'll be doing an interview with Mark Knoll. We'll be talking about allusions to the Silmarillion in Lord of the Rings. We're
And
going to
the
be doing
Discarded
Discarded
Image.
Image.
Yep.
Mhm.
So we'll continue last Friday of every month.
Yeah.
But also look for the Wonders of the Wade video series, which would be first and third Friday of every month on YouTube and on the Wade website.
Yeah.
So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having
interesting
us.
episode.
yes, thank you.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.